We all know that Theresa May has sold us out on fishing, on EU courts and on trade, but I've been speaking to defence experts who are telling me that she's also sold us out in the Brexit negotiations on Britain's military autonomy. So I'm asking, what's really going on with Brexit and defence?
This is a dangerous fantasy. The idea that there's going to be a European Air Force, a European army, it is simply not true.
Macron's calling for a new European army.
No, we should never be part of a European army.
This is about the most serious compromise of our security that you can imagine.
The present picture is potentially disastrous.
When people voted for Brexit, they voted to take back control. But under this, regarding defence, we are still a rule taker.
But we're going to continue to oppose any idea of an EU army.
In 2016, when Britain voted to leave the European Union, just over there is the HQ of Vote Leave, there was a sense of optimism in the country. Brexiteers really thought that we were going to retake control of our laws and our sovereignty, and especially defence campaigners at the time from a group called Veterans for Britain really thought that we were finally going to take back control of our defence autonomy. However, the picture now, and at the end of this whole process, seems to be totally different.
The present picture is potentially disastrous. There's going to be a surrender which will make the surrender in Singapore in 1942 look a minor event, because this is going to affect the way that we defend ourselves, the way we manufacture our defence equipment, and indeed it will affect every young soldier, man or woman, who's sent off, as I alluded to earlier, by oligarchs in Brussels who are not elected.
I spoke to Colonel Richard Kemp, who is currently in the Middle East, and I asked him whether the UK has used British defence in the negotiations enough to get concessions from the European Union.
I think the government has used its armed forces as a kind of throwaway bargaining chip. It sees them as no more than that, unfortunately. And effectively, the government's committed us to numerous defence mechanisms and indicated it will commit us to even deeper entanglement in the EU defence mechanisms. And all they've done it for, they haven't done it for any gain for us, they've simply done it to ease negotiations in other areas so that it doesn't become a stumbling block. In other words, it's a kind of form of appeasement of the EU by throwing away our armed forces, and that's not good enough.
Just months after the Brexit vote, UK ministers Boris Johnson, Michael Fallon and Alan Duncan, who are in charge of the Foreign Office and in charge of the defence aspect of the UK, they all said that they would let the EU get on with creating their European army. And the reason they did that is because they didn't want to be a dog in a manger, as Boris Johnson said at the time. So they thought Britain wouldn't be signing up to any of this stuff. But in the end, a year later, the DEXU, the Department for Exiting the European Union, published a paper that said that we were going to sign up to so many aspects of EU defence.
It's no part of our agenda to seek to undermine or to be dog-in-the-manger-ish about the EU. Now, and there's a conversation going on now about the EU's desire to build a common security and defence policy, new architecture for that. You know, if they want to do that, fine.
The British people had instructed the government to leave the EU. The EU wished, after we had left, to create its military identity, and therefore Mr. Fallon was among those who said we shouldn't be a dog in the manger. We shouldn't obstruct what they want to do. So it was on the express understanding that Britain would not be participating in any of these many initiatives, the European Defence Fund, the European procurement plans, and on and on. It was on the understanding that we would not participate that our officials advised that these things should be waved through. What happened was that suddenly there came a change of mind.
On the 12th of September 2017, they actually published a paper, the Department for Exiting the European Union. I emphasise again, the Department for Exiting the European Union published a paper saying that Britain should sign up to the European Union's ambitions for common defence structures, an EU military staff, EU military headquarters, European Union controls over defence industry and procurement and the technology they have, and ultimately European control over defence policy and even foreign policy. And that was after the Brexit referendum, where people had voted to leave. The response of the British government was to just pretend that Brexit isn't happening, indeed the reverse. So it's not that we're not opting out of certain aspects of the European Union. The government, as it stands at this moment, actually actively wants to partake in the European Union's ambitions, which are largely underpinned by the Lisbon Treaty, but they're desperate to have more and more of these structures put in place and take control over defence and ultimately foreign policy.
Number 10 and the government are very dismissive of the claims made by these veterans and commentators about EU defence structures. So I asked Veterans for Britain spokesperson David Banks to explain exactly how the UK is joining some kind of an EU army.
The way the UK is involved in the EU's defence architecture is that ministers have signed up to 5 separate EU Council agreements which govern the preamble to a single EU military. Now, the Chequers Plan and the withdrawal agreement seek to keep us in all of those things, and it's all happened since the Brexit vote. Now, what it does is that it creates a financial underpinning, a regulatory landscape, and decision-making structure in the event of military emergency. We're tied in with all those things. We're even subscribing to the EU's defence policy, CSDP, which is the glue that fits all these things together.
So what is it exactly that the UK has signed up to? Well, take a look at this. Here are some of the organisations that the UK has pledged to cooperate with or join in with.
Cooperative Financial Mechanism, the European Defence Agency,
European Defence Technological and Industrial Base,
the European Defence Agency, the Military Planning and Conduct Capability,
New Athena Mechanism, Coordinated Annual Review on Defence,
the European Defence Fund, the European procurement plans,
Common Foreign and Security Policy, Common Security and Defence Policy,
Military Planning and Conduct Capability, EU Battle Groups.
So how did we get to this point where the UK is signing up to so many different aspects of EU defence? Well, one of the key questions is, how much impact did the civil service have on this part of the negotiations?
The Sun newspaper came into possession of a recording of the defence advisor to Mr. Oliver Robbins, the Prime Minister's principal advisor on Brexit in number 10 Downing Street, a young gentleman called Alistair Brockbank. And in this tape, which was made at a private session in my own former university, actually, the London School of Economics, where he was addressing an audience principally of European diplomats, we hear Mr. Brockbank openly chortling about plans to hoodwink the 17.4 million British people who voted to leave the European Union with what he calls fluffy language, whilst at the same time preparing to commit the United Kingdom to be subordinate within this emerging European defence structure.
You're just about to hear a previously unheard clip. It's an exclusive to this documentary where we've got Alistair Brockbank, who was the figure that Professor Prince was just talking about, the chief civil servant in terms of the advisor to Ollie Robbins in defence. He's talking about the common security and defence policy of the European Union and whether the UK will be leaving it. He says that there will be no gap between the current situation and the situation after Brexit. This goes to the key point about whether Theresa May's Brexit deal means we are leaving the European Union at all.
And honestly speaking, kind of off the record, this has caused some kind of quite difficult political conversations in the last couple of weeks in the UK. Where we think things should be is that, and similar to what the EU put out in their kind of future guidelines, is that there should be no gap on CFSP and CSDP.
The more and more that people have looked into this, we found that there's this unholy trinity between 3 key people operating at the heart of the British government whose pushed much of this upon the UK, and they are of course Ollie Robbins, who we all know, but also Alistair Brockbank and Angus Lapsley. They are the three names where ministers and MPs need to ask some very, very searching questions about what's gone on and how our armed forces have been sold out to the European Union.
Having watched how defence works in Whitehall when I was involved, and it worked extremely well, what amazes me is how MPs have allowed civil servants to creep in under the radar and enact all sorts of things that they shouldn't. Why aren't MPs taking an interest in this, and why aren't they reeling them in?
So how much did MPs really know about what's going on? Well, what did the government say to them, and did the government explain that the UK has signed up to all these EU defence structures? Well, I've been speaking to several MPs who are telling me that the government really didn't tell them what was going on. So let's see what they have to say.
Government needs to be absolutely upfront and clear about what we're being signed up to. Leaving the European Union isn't just a trading matter, it's about leaving in all aspects of it, so we are sovereign in our own land again, and that is very important when it comes to defence and security. And if by the back door we're being signed up to various agencies and bodies and structures that still tie us in to EU policy on defence and security, that is not what the British people voted for. That has to be stopped. Our government has a duty to be completely upfront about what is being proposed, what we're committing to after Brexit, because otherwise we will find out, and we won't be forgiven if we sign ourselves up to things that undermine the right of the British people and the British government to make its own decisions when it comes to the most important thing of all, which is the defence and security of these islands. NATO and Five Eyes are fundamental to that, and I believe that anything that waters that down and undermines our commitment to those two structures would be very dangerous and detrimental to our long-term defence and security of the United Kingdom.
The defence and security elements of any future arrangement and agreement with the European Union has been almost wholly overlooked by Parliament. And of course the issues around the European Army have been very sensitive ones in the UK, and indeed it can be argued that the UK has prevented the European Union making sense of European defence integration over the decades we have belonged to the European Union or the European Community previously. As we leave, the opportunity for our European partners to drive efficiencies out of all the money those liberal democracies spend on defence, I would see as an opportunity for there to be more defence capability in the hands of the liberal democracies, our partner nations, as we move into a new world with the rise, particularly with the rise of China. However, if the United Kingdom is, by whatever arrangements are agreed, are tied into that defence integration, with no say around the political direction of those forces and that capability, then we've just got ourselves into the worst of all worlds. And I think this subject is in urgent need of very close attention by Parliament about what the medium to long-term implications are of what we appear to be signing up to.
I've been on the Brexit committee for over 2 years since its inception, and with the evidence that we was getting, I thought I had a handle on what was going on with Brexit. Now, it wasn't until 4 or 5 months ago that I met Veterans for Britain, and they enlightened me really about, since a referendum, the powers and sovereignty that we've been giving away to the EU, which really has gone unnoticed with a lot of MPs. And I was quite flabbergasted, and that's not acceptable. I mean, we talk about, well, the government talks about this deep and special partnership, but we should be able to pick and choose what we want to do. We shouldn't be, guaranteeing financial contributions and guaranteeing that we will accept their directives regarding procurement. We are still a rule taker under the current system, and that's not acceptable. And I think the more that MPs talk about it, the more that Veterans for Britain talk about it, and the more the media pick up on it, importantly, everybody will be better informed, and we can actually take back our sovereignty regarding defence.
Some people argue that it's not a problem that we're signing up to any of these EU defence institutions. The government argues that we're just cooperating with our allies and that it makes it more efficient and more effective to do it this way and to secure our defence on an international basis. However, I wanted to know, what is the main issues with signing up to all these EU defence institutions for the UK as we leave the European Union?
Well, just look at our history. I think of Nelson. He's an old boy of my school, and we paraded out at Trafalgar Day every year, but you know, he represents how important it is to be an independent military power, to be able to stand up to tyranny, to bring world order, to be able to impose British values on the world, which is a good thing. And you know, it's as true now as it was then, and we are still a military power in our own right. We're not the military power in the world, but we are a military power in our own right. And when we start to allow others to control our military power, then effectively we are no longer a nation state. We lose our pride, you know, we lose the backbone of the nation, and we lose our world power, not just in hard military power, but actually we lose it in soft power as well.
If I try and imagine now being in the army and being tasked what to do by the EU, I'd have real problems with that. Because 2005, when I was standing up in Royal Academy Sandhurst, you swear an oath to the Queen and to the country, and although that sounds a bit jingoistic, it's there because you believe in what you're doing. Quite frankly, we went from an economic union, which was great, like no doubt useful at the time, but all these things slightly overstep their mark, and the EU did that many years ago. So as a result, swearing my oath of allegiance to Jean-Claude Juncker, I'd find particularly difficult. Number one, I don't even know who he is as an individual. I mean, I know his background, I've seen his CV, I know what he does. But compared to the sort of history and the fact that I can encompass within swearing an oath to the Queen all the things that I hold dear about a country, the people in it, what we're all looking to try and achieve outside it, and tying in around that sort of mentality, that's very easy to do.
The United Kingdom has a proud record of defence of freedom, defence of our democracy, our British way of life. And we've had great leaders that have proved that when Britain is being threatened, when Britain is being attacked, we stand firm and defend the democracy that our forebears have fought so long and so hard to hand down to the next generation. We must do the same. We must follow the same determined approach of former leaders like Churchill, Margaret Thatcher and others who have ensured that the freedom of these islands remains paramount. We can only do that if we are an independent, self-governing, sovereign nation that makes our own decisions about our own destiny. Anything that waters that down and undermines the right of the British people to make those decisions will undermine the United Kingdom itself.
We have been an independent nation for about 1,000 years and have run our own defence. And that's what I expect. That's what millions of people who voted to get out expected. They didn't expect that power over their armed forces would be handed to the European Union. And this is what is being proposed now. And it is just absolute disgrace that it should be doing this.
This whole issue with defence is so unknown to everyone, it seems. The public, MPs, Parliament. The government has done a brilliant job at hiding the fact that we have actually signed up to so many aspects of EU defence. It's so important that MPs and the public understand that the withdrawal agreement and Theresa May's Brexit deal in general means that we could be tied to an EU army.